You can have concentrated wealth or you can have democracy, but you can't have both.
In the name of freedom, we've lost more freedoms than we've gained.
Many more children bear the scars.
Hate, fear, jealousy, one group against another group.
When we consider that women are treated as
when
property.
it becomes your son or your daughter, will you take interest then?
Hi, I'm George Kilpatrick, and you have access to the unfiltered voices of our guests. The Syracuse Peace Council has been keeping the peace in central New York since 1936. They've been agitating and organizing to promote global peace. Now, best known for their anti-war efforts, and in particular their opposition to the current war in Iraq, Peace Council members say they see a link between their efforts to ensure peace abroad and their work to promote peace here in the community. Tonight, we get access inside the Syracuse Peace Council with its members. Joining us tonight is Andy Major. He's on the staff of the Syracuse Peace Council. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be here, George.
Also joining us is Gabe Barry Caulfield. She's a youth activist and an organizer with the Peace Council and a recent graduate of Nottingham High School. Congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Roxanne Hill. Roxanne is a member of the Syracuse Peace Council Steering Committee, and we welcome Roxanne as well to the program. And one of the reasons why, Andy, I invited you to come is I was reading a story in the paper a couple of weeks ago about an effort that you're working on with the Dunbar Center, Dunbar Association located here in Syracuse, and it struck me as very different from the kind of work I associate with the Peace Council. We hear mostly about protests to the war. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a few moments, and your successful Fahrenheit 9/11 screening. But the work that you're going to do with Dunbar Youth and how that ties into what the Peace Council does.
Well, we see things holistically, George. So we recognize that there's a connection between violence around the world, violence carried out by our government in our name, and violence that happens in our community, in our streets, and in our homes. So we try to look at all of those levels. As a small organization, we can't be kind of the spearheading organization on all those issues, but we think that we have something particular to bring to young people about violence. And part of that is that kind of broader perspective that we understand that the violence that they are experiencing in their lives, that they may be encouraged to engage in by their friends, by sort of the culture around them, that there's a connection between that and what they see if they look at the news, if they open up the newspaper, what they see our government leaders saying and doing. So we're very excited about the collaboration with Dunbar Center, and it's really an extension of work that we did with a variety of other community centers over the past year and a half or so.
And that work involves what, Andy? What do you do exactly?
There are a series of workshops that get young people to look at what the violence is like in their own lives. How have they experienced it? What has it meant for their lives? So that they don't just think about it as sort of the excitement and the action, but they think about what it's meant to their lives, how it's affected them. We then get them to look at nonviolence and what does it mean. And the kids can say a lot typically about what violence is, what constitutes violence. They have fewer answers when it comes to nonviolence. But we then encourage them to think about what are some steps in their life if they want to make their lives more nonviolent. Then we do some role playing, so playing out some potential conflict scenarios that they experience. How could they do things differently to avoid violence in their daily lives?
I'm sure a lot of this stems from the very messages. You talk about the government, but right at home, in our own homes. I mean, we sort of reinforce messages of violence even with the things that we do. So
the things we do, the things we say, it's so deep in our culture, and those of us who see that this is not working. It's not working for us globally. It's not working for us as a nation. It's not working for us here in Syracuse. So we need to do something different. And we believe that those pieces need to be brought together and connected. And we think the Peace Council can play a helpful role in doing that. At the same time that we couldn't do what we're doing with Dunbar if Dunbar wasn't there as a strong presence in the South Side community doing great work, or the Northeast Community Center on the North Side, or other such centers.
You know, so our vision, though, our image of the Peace Council or peace activists is, you know, the peace sign, colorful clothes, tie-dye or whatever. And a small movement of people. How do you take what people perceive the Peace Council to be, Andy, and move it to where it's a more mainstream activity that people say, you know, I've got to get down with that?
Well, we believe that that democracy means having to engage in what's happening in our community. It means more than just voting on November 2nd this year. That's something we think is very important. We think this is a particularly important election year to make a change. But we also think that demonstrating, calling our legislators, getting involved on the community level are critical. And part of what we need to do is be more active in those parts of what we do. I think at times we have focused more exclusively on what's happening in other parts of the world and not enough what's happening in our own community. We're in the process of moving that. For example, the Peace Council's been lending a lot of support to the folks trying to stop a sewage treatment plant in the Midland neighborhood right now, so that we're wanting to be seen as a resource by people struggling for justice throughout this community.
Yeah, social justice being a key tenor of what the Peace Council does. Roxanne, it seems like you wanted to get in on some of this. Go ahead, take your shot.
Sure. I just want to sort of expand again the ways in which young people learn about violence. And I think it's really important for us to think about that for the most part in our society, that people learn about violence, first and foremost, it starts out in the home. And from that point forward, it broadens. So in the home, for example, I think about within African American communities, it's socially acceptable to engage in physical violence against your children as a form of discipline. And that
spanking.
Spanking. See?
See, no, but you said it that you said it that way because you want to help us to rethink that. Right. Say it again.
Right.
Engage
in violence as a form of discipline, and defining this as corporal punishment.
Many of us believe that that is appropriate, and you say that's where the message starts.
Yeah, it starts there. It goes on, and it pertains to how one spouse engages and interacts with the other spouse, whether it entails ending an argument through physical violence or through some form of coercion. Children see this and they adapt these behaviors as a part of normative ways of ending and handling conflict. And then you go, it's broader than that, and then you go out into the community and young people then say that, well, then it's okay to settle a disagreement with, you know, my homie down the block with physical violence or with a weapon or with a knife. And so essentially, I think that as a society, adults in the society, we have to take a greater responsibility in terms of teaching young people that it's not okay. It's not okay at the individual level, it's not okay at the group level, and it's not okay certainly at the national level.
Let me pick out one of the, just to this whole notion of corporal, no, as you put it, physical violence as a form of discipline against children, and how prevalent that might be or acceptable that might be in certain cultures within the community. Then throw into that the religious component, where spare the rod, spoil the child, and this whole social that growing up, I remember you were to act right when you were out in public. And so the way to correct that behavior in private was a little tap, or what, you know, but that is a form of violence.
Whether with a child or with a partner.
With a partner.
That's right.
Because that's the way we settle, and that's the way we straighten out. So can a Peace Council help us to relearn what has been ingrained in us from the very beginning?
And see, and I think it's really important that various projects look at, one, the way that we learn about violence, the ways in which in our society we find it socially acceptable, how violence is used in our society. It's used as a means of entertainment primarily and fundamentally. This is what normalizes violence more broadly. It's used as, even as an aphrodisiac. It's used in lyrics as a way to entertain and to titillate. There are so many different ways in which violence is used, and therefore we need to sort of get back to that, help people understand the ways in which, you know, where violence is omnipresent, and therefore it becomes normalized, and people don't think twice about it, and they're not reluctant to use it or engage in it.
So then that link then becomes acceptable as we look at what happens in a global sense. We'll get back to you on that, because I know, Gabe, yes,
well,
Andy.
One thing I wanted to add to what Roxanne was saying, and it's good to do it before we have a young person talk, is that I think it's much more important what we do as adults than what we say to children. You know, we do a lot of, this is the way you're supposed to do it, young person, and then we behave very differently.
Right.
So that, and one of the best examples in my mind was under President Clinton, that when the Columbine massacre happened out in Colorado, he came on the news and said, you know, young people need to know you can't solve your problems with violence.
And then,
this was days after he had ordered the bombing of Kosovo, where under his command, you know, U.S. planes were dropping bombs on people all over this other country, where he was using violence as a way to solve a conflict. And young people are smart. They know when we're being hypocritical and we're saying do this, but they're doing something else.
But I don't want to seem naive, but that is the way we solve conflicts, isn't it, in this world? In other words, we're a country, we have, since 9/11, now more at stake in terms of what we have to protect. And so, and I think this is a critical point. I'd love for you to address this, and then Gabe, we'll get you in here seriously. But in this climate where America's now, defenses are up and, you know, we got terror alerts all the time, this is a difficult sell to say that we're not going to use our stick if you use your stick. In other words, it's one thing for us to sit back and say we're not going to use our stick, but at the same time, we're looking at people who, for religious, in some cultural instances, will sacrifice themselves for the greater cause. And we're not innocent either in terms of what we do. But I'm saying in this climate, it's a tough sell.
Well, it is and it isn't. You know, people are overwhelmingly now saying that this war on Iraq was a big mistake.
We heard that.
And many, many people are recognizing, as we said long before the war started,
You said
that
that
this
last
would
year.
stimulate more anger at the United
Right
States.
on the show,
It would
yeah.
stimulate more violence against the United
said that,
States.
yeah.
So, you know, we need to stop being aggressive, stop being a bully, in order to not be targeted.
But Andy, I'm saying it's too late now, isn't it?
Well,
because we are out of the bag now. We have bombed this. We're engaged in a war, and now we're sort of. I mean, so we can't.
You make a good point, and I think part of it is being adult enough to apologize. And it would be great if the president or other people in Congress and leaders in this country would say, we made an error. We waged war on Iraq based on misinformation, based on lies. We're sorry we did it. How can we really help Iraq move towards democracy, support their efforts as opposed to impose our will? But these are difficult questions, no doubt.
Gabe, I know you want to get in here.
As I was listening to Roxanne speak, one of the things that kept running through my mind was the connection within youth violence within schools and how youth are disciplined in schools. We're searched every day as we enter the building. We have to take off our shoes to make sure we don't have knives in our shoes. And yet, in the hall, we have military recruiters telling us to join the military and go be trained to fight in a more disciplined manner. And I just think that it's really odd how there's sort of a double standard of which kind of violence is okay, which kind of violence is acceptable. And I think it's really important to give youth a new idea and sort of redirect where violence is going. I think that it lies a lot in youth being ready for this. As Andy had mentioned, when older people sort of tell us, this is what you have to do and this is how you're going to be successful, it sort of seems as a big power figure telling us what we're going to do, and naturally we react violently and we rebel. And I think it's important it has to come from us, and the change has to come from the youth.
So what did the youth, I mean, how do you see, like your work through the Peace Council, you were involved in efforts of youth empowerment for peace. You had an event earlier this year, Drop Beats, Not Bombs, and how did this message ring so clear for you as a young person?
I was raised in a community that said that violence was not the answer and that violence was not the way that you solved your problems, which is very different from a way that a lot of other people were raised. And as I grew older and I began to go to public schools, I saw that a lot of other people had learned that violence was the way.
Was the answer.
That was the way. And so for me, that was a little bit sort of shocking. It was kind of, what is this? It was really new. And I saw that I had been blessed with the gift of seeing it in a different way. And by my work, I wanted to give people a voice to voice their opinions and sort of learn that violence isn't okay and give youth an idea about violence not being okay.
You know, but it's so ingrained, and I want to pull you back in, Roxanne, and we can all get in on this. But as I hear you describe your experience going into an environment where you were taught that we behave in a certain way, we respect other people, then to go in a situation where violence is the accepted norm, and you know, you hit me or you said something and I call you out of your name. It's difficult to come out of that, and you work with young people where these very issues are on the table. How does someone like Gabe and other kids who want to do the right thing, who want to step aside in this culture of, if you show, you don't want to get punked, right? Let's talk about that. You don't want to be. So how do you do that without being punked?
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, it's fascinating. I train staff who work with young people that do violence prevention, and one of the staff members was on maternity leave, so I had to go back in, and so I was sort of on the line, and I said, you know, how am I going to go in? And I said, you know, I have to go in and I have to be honest. And so, you know, I went in and I talked about, you know, I'm coming in, I'm going to do violence prevention with you, and right now we're at war and we engage in this preemptive strike. How do you feel about that? You know, and so I think I begin with being honest with them about the way in which we use violence in our society. And just start there to really challenge them around these strongly held beliefs about how to end conflict. And it was really fascinating. I probably did about two of the workshops. But you know, it begins with helping them really reconstruct their beliefs about this concept of violence, how to behave, methods, thinking about this idea of a trigger. And a trigger is, you know, somebody talks about your mama.
Right.
You know, you have to reciprocate, you know, how you respond to a trigger, how difficult it is, that it takes more strength to back down from a fight or a disagreement than it does to engage in a fight and a disagreement. And then I like to keep reconnecting that to the bigger picture. What might we done as a superpower with our power to show strength, as Andy talked about? I mean, to me, it's significantly more. It shows much more character and strength to say that we made a mistake than to go in and bomb a people who, for the most part, lack many of the things that we take for granted here in the United States. And now we're going back to rebuild. And so I think that there are a series of things. I think a lot of it is just a re-education process that you need to engage in with young people. And more than that, it's just critical to move beyond the hypocrisy that we engage in day to day in terms of our behaviors and our actions at all levels, whether it has to do with the family context, whether it has to do with the community context, whether it has to do with corporate greed and various forms of violence that might not even have to do with weapons and may have to do with how we treat folks.
You know, that you're going to say, Gabe, you want to?
Well, I was just going to say that I wanted to go back to that reinforcement. When we see, as a young person, when we see the way that a government solves their problems is by bombing a country, is by using physical force, then we see that as, oh, if I want something, then how I'm going to use it is I'm going to use physical force.
Be aggressive,
I'm gonna,
go take it.
Right. I'm going to continuously punch this person until they give me what I want, because that's what we've been shown is the way to get our way.
Well, let me ask you, Andy.
One other piece that I think is important is that we tend to think, as you were talking earlier, George, about, you know, that our military and this war making it's defensive. And I think that's not the case for the most part. The United States operates in the world as a bully. And if we look at, you know, the situations that Gabe finds herself in, sometimes we can see in schools there's bullies. It's pretty straightforward. There's a kid there who's bigger and stronger, and he's going to threaten other kids. Maybe he won't have to beat them up. Maybe they'll give him his lunch money or their bicycle just by the threats. But maybe he's going to he'll beat him up. And I think that's a much more honest analogy than this sort of, we don't want to be the police of the world kind of analogy.
So as I understand that, then as a bully, the way it's then sold back to the American people is in the name of national security. That's the connection I hear you making.
National security, and we need to defend ourselves, exactly what you were saying before. But again, you know, again, if we think about children, it's quite common that we see, as parents, we'll see the kid who reacts, as opposed to the one who started it.
Exactly.
Right. And I think that as the people of this country, we need to really look more carefully at what our government's doing. We need to look beyond the primary sources of information who aren't really interested in giving us the full truth about what happened and what continues to happen. So we need to think for ourselves and really act as citizens in a democratic country.
Yeah, I wanted to have you bring up, Roxanne and then Gabe, I wanted to get you in on this as well. This notion of how poor and disenfranchised people, how in terms of violence prevention and how difficult it is, or what the process is when dealing with people who feel like they have nothing to lose.
Mm-hmm. I think that I think that it's probably a bit easier to engage in violent and in particular life-threatening violence if you don't feel very good about yourself or you don't really have very good prospects for the future. And so I think that often poor minority youth may engage in violence because of that.
And be victims.
And be victims. And so it's going to require a lot of pieces. Some of those pieces are sort of anti-poverty pieces, making sure that young people within inner cities, particularly now that we're in the midst of the summer, make sure young people have work and they have opportunities to participate and feel like they're an integral part of the community, that they're valued members of society. And
is it true, Roxanne, Gabe, that you in your school that there were kids that didn't have books? Is this true? In a East Side City high school?
It's true. Right now,
Nottingham High School, I should say?
Yeah, there is a huge lack of budget within Nottingham High School. And a lot of the other city schools, we do what we can, but textbooks are at a lacking, paper is at a lacking. It's just so expensive, and there's sort of hesitancy to sign books out to students because they don't come back. And then we lose so much money in these textbooks that aren't coming back. I wanted to add on to what you said, Roxanne, about kids in how education and these kids aren't being encouraged, and being a poor kid is sort of encouraging violence. School systems, in a way, are also encouraging that as well by the Leave No Child Behind Act, which is forcing, it's standardizing everything so the kids that are in the middle have everything, and if you can fit into the middle, then you're all right. But if you fall off on the end, where do you go? You drop off, you go back into the streets, and you become a victim of violence again. And we blame these oppressed. What about the oppressors? What about the people who are putting these kids in the street?
And who are the oppressors, Andy?
Well, we live in a very unequal society. We live in a society where a very small percentage of people own most of the wealth, control most of the resources, and that's really fundamentally at odds with democracy. It's hard to have political democracy when you have such economic inequality. So it's a huge problem. And one of the other things about violence that I think is important here is that at times people are told, who are powerless, don't use violence. And part of what they're being told is stay in your place, accept that this is the way it is. And that's not at all what we're saying. We're saying to young people, we want you to work to make this world a better place, that you're right, that your neighborhood should not be like this, that your school should have all the resources it needs. Right. And we want to engage with you, and how can we work together to make that happen non-violently?
Well, tying all of that together, in terms of no textbooks in the school and poor, disenfranchised, and violent, you say that that has to do with our priorities vis-a-vis spending, that the reason why there's not enough resources for things like education is because of this misappropriation.
Right. The United States spends more money on the military than most of the other countries of the world
And we'll need
combined.
to spend more, likely.
Well, I don't think we'll need to. They may choose to. Just one figure to throw out to people is that in New York State next year, we'll pay $1.5 billion for nuclear weapons, these weapons which we say other people shouldn't have. That same amount of money could be used to hire an additional 20,000 elementary school teachers, to ease class overcrowding, to make sure that our children get a good start. That's the kind of priorities that we want and that we think the people of Syracuse want.
How do I promote peace here in the community through the Peace Council and other efforts, Gabe? How do I do it?
By promoting peace, I think it's important to speak out against the injustices and be very vocal about what isn't right. And there's sort of an attitude of fear and apathy amongst youth, and I think it's really important for the older people to give youth a place to speak out. So, like letting me be on your show and speaking out.
All right, that place to speak out is the Syracuse Peace Council. Call them at this number, please, 315-472-5478. Visit them on the web at peacecouncil.net. Lots of resources. They've got a newsletter. They've got some bike clinics, and they've got work going on in the community. Andy Major, thank you. Gabe Barry Caulfield, thank you. And Roxanne Hill, thank you all for joining us. How do you feel? Let us know, would you please? Right Access with George Kilpatrick, Post Office Box 2400, Syracuse, New York, 13220 on the web, or email us, accessgk@wcny.org. Watch for Ark's Sake tomorrow night. Tavis Smiley coming up next. Thank you for joining us tonight, and remember, WCNY gives you access.